If you're listening right now in the room or later on in the week, my name's David Young. I'm a member of Boot Brisbane, and with me tonight, our special guest is the Honourable John Mickel down there in southeast Queensland. He's a former Speaker of the Queensland Parliament. He's an Adjunct Professor at QUT and a Strategic Advisor at the Rowland Group. Good evening, John. How are you?
Very well, thanks, and it's lovely to be invited.
Yes, thank you very much for your time, and we really appreciate it. And also with us this evening, as always, is Bill Bates. Welcome, Bill.
Good evening, David.
Oh, excellent. Well, gents, I feel like we should jump straight into it, and we need the expert opinion of John. John, are we going to have a hung parliament this week, this election in Queensland? And do you think if there is a hung parliament, the representatives that are in Central and North Queensland, the minor parties, can find a voice and actively achieve much with that hung parliament? What are your thoughts on that? Sorry to go straight to a big topic.
No. Look, you might as well go straight into it. Will there be a hung parliament? There was a American baseball coach, I think it was, called Yogi Berra. He said the worst thing about predictions is it's about the future. I am fabulous. I am fabulous when it comes to hindsight. I can tell you exactly what's happened. I've found hindsight with the general public is the best sight there is. They can always tell you why you stuffed it up. Look, the way the parliament is, with the government with a 2-seat majority and a pandemic and an economic downturn that is as bad as the Great Depression, you couldn't bet on anything, meaning this, that I think people would say that the Queensland government has done a good job with the pandemic, and that will be as long as we don't have a pandemic outbreak here in Queensland. Now, a month ago, if I'd have been doing this podcast at the start of the year and said to you, listen, none of you are you're going to be locked down in your houses for a couple of weeks. The economy is going to turn really, really bad. The government is going to forget all about debt and deficit. You would have said, gee, it was interesting having that guy on the podcast. He was absolutely mad. And yet in a few short months, that's what our world has been. The election's on October the 31st. And I just would not like to say what would happen. However, you're not on opium if you think that there could be a hung parliament. Given the fact that the government has only got 2 seats to defend, and given that neither of the major parties have an easy task to negotiate in the current government's case, extra seats, and particularly in North and Far North Queensland. And the reason for that is the presence and the significant presence of the minor parties. They're the inhibitor to Deb Frecklington winning, and they are the inhibitor to Labor looking to increase its majority. So pandemic and how that plays out over the next few weeks, and who by October the 31st or thereabouts, people are willing to either blame or praise for the economic predicament they're in.
And that position's 100% fair enough, yeah.
That's about the best I can do for you. I can point to seats. The other thing that's happened, and I'll say this to both of you, is the collapse, if you will, of the print media throughout regional Queensland. And the fact that the media in general in Queensland are doing it tough because of advertising means that we're not going to have anything in the way of useful polling to guide us in that prediction. Now, I know there was a poll published in the Sunday Mail a couple of weeks ago when it made all sorts of predictions about how Queensland would end up. The problem with that is it assumed that all the minor parties run behind the major parties. And in Far North and Northern Queensland, that is just not the case. the minor parties win seats in their own right. And can I bore you with a few statistics?
Not at all. Go for it, John.
I don't know the age of I don't know the age of you two guys, so I'm going to assume that you know a bit of history if you're younger than me. But when I was a kid and growing up, and until the last decade and a half or the last 20 years or so, at any election, the major parties could wander out and get 80% of the primary vote between them. That is 40% for Labor, 40% for the Liberal and National parties. Over the last 20 years or so, that's come down to about 70%, which means there's 30% sloshing around out there. When I had a look at the 19 seats from Gladstone right up to far north and western Queensland, I found that of the 19 seats, the major parties' share of the primary vote, that is 70% or more, is found in only 2 seats. In 8 seats, that primary share is 60% to 70%. In a further 5 seats, it is 50% to 60%. That is, in 13 seats, the major parties are struggling in northern, far northern Queensland to get 70%. But it gets worse. I sound like the Demtel man, but it gets worse. In 3 seats, they do not get between 40 and they get 40 to 50%. And in 1 seat, the major parties struggle to get above 20%. So it is fertile ground, northern and far northern Queensland, for minor parties, given the collapse of the primary vote of the major parties. So therein, if you're seeking to influence election outcomes, therein lies your best prospect. That's the good news.
Oh, that was just the good news, was it, John?
Worrying news is this. Yes. But, so what I'm saying is, you know, in northern and far northern Queensland, the major parties are struggling to get 50% of the primary vote between them. The rest is shared by a combination of Katter's Australia Party, One Nation, the Greens, and independents. So any group that can cobble together that grouping for their cause stands a chance, and stands a better chance if it's a minority government. As I said, the sobering news with that is this. The Greens are strongest in the provincial city seats, and they are strongest in the seat of Barron River, which is in Cairns, and that's where they get 12.5%. They are weakest in the mining areas, so Traeger and Burdekin. One Nation, on the other hand, is strongest in Morani, which is around Mackay and Rockhampton, and Burdekin, which is to the south of Townsville. One Nation's strongest there. Katter's Australian Party are safest. They have the safest seats in Parliament now. In Traeger, held by Robbie Katter, held by Shane Knuth, and Hinchinbrook, which is between Cairns and Townsville, held by Nick Demetto. All of those are impressive people in their own right. The trouble for you guys is that they are all within the federal division of Kennedy, held by Bob Katter, Senior. The independents, and I said there's a showing of independents, they tend to be breakaways from major parties rather than have a policy platform. So at the last election, the breakaway was in Cairns, where what's his name, Rob Pine,
Rob
got
Pine.
19% of the vote. And in Rockhampton, where the mayor was denied Labor Party pre-selection and ran as an independent and scored 23% of the vote. Now, that high independent vote in those two seats will not be replicated this time. Then, since the election, we've had a defection in the seat of Whitsunday. Well, not so much a defection, they booted him out, which was Jason Costigan, who's now representing the Queensland First Party at the election. So he'll be taking on the Liberal National Party and Labor and trying to find his own way through there. So it's full of opportunity. The issue with the minor parties is this. With Qatar can be the authentic voice in rural and probably provincial Queensland, but at the moment he is confined, or they are confined, to the areas in and around the federal seat of Kennedy. Now, they run close in other areas, but that's where they get elected. One Nation at the moment, whilst it gets high votes, is also a personality-based show around Pauline Hanson. But alas, she does not support a new Queensland state, a breakaway state in the north of Queensland. And the independents tend to be breakaways from the major parties and scored well last time, but will they go well again? Then we've got to wait and see what the Palmer Party does. My hunch is it'll spend big. They support a separate state. The question is, where will they run and how well they'll do? Certainly at the federal election, it seemed to be a spoilers show rather than a serious show. And their last outing in the Townsville City Council, whilst it had plenty of money, it failed to produce any great fireworks, really. The mayor got elected really untroubled. So that's the scenario.
If I can just jump in there.
Oh, yes, sorry. I wasn't sure if you were finishing up, but yeah, go, Bill.
No, I thought we're just winding down, but we'd just pick up on one of the things that you touched on the One Nation. In general, just looking back like the last federal election, the One Nation gets a certain percentage of vote, and it mostly comes from disaffected nationals and people just seeking a new home out of the way of the two minor parties. But they don't actually offer the people of northern or central Queensland anything. When it comes to the actual candidates, I think the situation is someone just drops them a line saying, I want to be a candidate, stumps up a bit of money, gets an endorsement, and just goes out and sticks a few Pauline Hanson call flutes on. I don't think I've never seen, not up in this area in Cairns, where the actual candidate's face has been on the call flutes. And I think in the federal election, we had their member within a couple of weeks was found out for misadventures on the internet and was virtually not seen, but they still managed and didn't turn up to any debates or any publicity or anything like that, and still got, I think, about 15% of the votes for nothing. And I think the same thing was in the state election before that. People just dropped their names in. They got the tick from down in Brisbane, One Nation, and they basically just again campaigned under her face and did very little, and still got a reasonable percent of the vote. So I think this time there's probably an opportunity for a party to take votes away from One Nation if they fail to offer anything to Central and North Queensland, and especially now it's basically on record that Pauline Hanson has no confidence in the million people of Central and North Queensland governing themselves. Plus, that was reiterated in a interview with Malcolm Roberts. So basically, we've now got a situation where both the leader and the other senator basically says, right, the million people of North Queensland are not capable of governing themselves, and we won't support them being separate, and they don't even deserve the same political representation of the 520,000 people in Tasmania. So I don't know if that's going to fit well if someone plays that line going to the state election.
Yes, and we must also identify the point that, like the representatives in the state parliament that are Qatar elected, being inside of the electorate of Kennedy is the same reason why many people think that they would have difficulty winning any seats outside of that electorate. Is that predominantly the same reason I imagine that when a person decides to stand for One Nation, they make sure to put Pauline Hanson's face first on the call-fleece and then a very tiny silhouette of themselves to the corner. And what are your thoughts on that, John?
Well, historically, One Nation candidates rely on the personality of Pauline Hanson. One Nation historically has got their votes from being not who they are, but who they are not. And they are not the major parties, and people who are over the major parties have historically gone to One Nation. Now, the comment that they can be disaffected LNP people, that's true, but they can equally be disaffected Labor people. And so you see in a seat like, or in and around Ipswich, One Nation runs second there. Mundema in the most recent by-election, it ran second there. It ran second in Ipswich last time. So it has pockets of support, but the support is based, as I said, not on who they are, but who they are not. And historically, it hasn't really meant much in the way of policy. You're quite right. The people who put their names down are largely unknown even to One Nation, and put their names in and get the vote that Pauline Hanson would otherwise have got. Now, as I look, for example, at the seat of Cook, which you would think, well, given One Nation's racial policies, they shouldn't do well in. In actual fact, they ran second on the primary vote in Cook with 18% of the vote, and ended up running second to Labor in that seat. So it just goes to show that the Hanson brand and the Hanson name is worth everything to that party. But as you correctly identify, it's a personality-based party, and for your concerns, you're not going to get the support from them for the policy changes that you are seeking, because Malcolm Roberts would be speaking on behalf of Pauline Hanson when he articulated that view to you. So for yourselves to break through, you'll need social media to highlight your issue and get behind a group or groupings who are going to support your particular case.
Yes, 100%. And
With
gentlemen, I just want to quickly introduce Raj. Are you there? We have another person that's joined the panel, gentlemen. Raj Patel, who's a North Queenslander who's recently gone down to live in New South Wales, is joined us. So, Raj, did you have a question? Can Can you guys hear Raj?
Liberals and the Nationals.
No, he needs to reconnect.
Raj, you'll have to reconnect, mate. There's something wrong with your line. Yeah.
Is there something?
Okay,
Okay, I'll get
go
another.
again, Raj.
While he's back it around.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, Kurt.
Can you hear me now?
Go.
Oh,
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay. So my question really was the merger of the Liberals and the Nationals, which has completely killed the national vote in North Queensland, and isn't that the vote that's gone to Pauline Hanson? And my second point was that wasn't it the smartest move ever from Labor to have brought compulsory preferential voting, which results in, because when you look at the statistics, 80% of Green voters always preference Labor. But when you look at One Nation preferences, they're 50% go to LNP, 50% go to Labor. And that's in North Queensland. This is where Labor has very good chances of still winning, because the Conservative vote is so fragmented.
Your thoughts, John?
Yes.
Your thoughts, John?
Yeah, sure. Firstly, the whole process of compulsory preferential voting. Yes, the government chose to reintroduce compulsory preferential voting because it felt it disadvantaged it. I'm critical of
one moment, sorry, John. Raj, I don't know what your microphone situation is.
Yeah,
it's too close too close to your mouth. Yeah.
Sorry.
Okay, continue. Sorry, John.
The government should. Yeah, you're right. The government should have embarked on a process of full consultation on that, but that's not the substance of Raj's question. Once you get north of Noosa, Raj, what happens is that the proliferation of voters is on the right of the spectrum rather than the left of the spectrum where the Greens are. The Greens are strongest in inner city Brisbane and fall away as they go north and south from Brisbane. They have a slight re-emergence, only very slight, in the electorate of Barron River in Cairns, where they get 12%. I'm just having a look in Townsville just to make sure it's not making a fibber out of me. And in Townsville, I'm seeing they get 10.85%. Now, it is not true that the Green vote always goes 70% or 80% to Labor. It depends on the area. And in many instances in North and Far North Queensland, the Green vote counts for very little. In fact, I'll give you a sampling. In Hinchinbrook, so that's between Cairns and Townsville, they get 3% of the vote. You could get 100% of 3 and it's not going to make much difference. In the next seat down, Thuringowa, they get 5. In the seat closer into Townsville, they get 7, and as they get right into Townsville, it gets up to 10. But as they get out of Townsville, it goes down to 3. So they are not the defining factor in North and Far North Queensland. What the defining factor is the proliferation of candidates of the right. I'll pick a seat at random. I don't mean to pick one that supports my case, but I'll give you an example. Hill, represented by Shane Knuth. So the Counter-Australian Party in that seat gets 48% of the vote. The LNP gets 22%, and an independent got 0.78, and Stuart Worth, an independent, got 2.74. Interestingly, One Nation didn't run against the Catters, so the Catters got the lion's share of everything that wasn't Labor or LNP. my hunch is that Katters in that case lionised the Labor Party vote, but they also took a huge chunk out of the LNP vote. But that continues to be a phenomenon in the electorate of Kennedy, the federal electorate of Kennedy. If you go down to Traeger, held by Robbie Katter gets 66% of the primary vote. There's nobody comes near that. What does the Labor Party get in a seat that it was one of their safest seats? The Labor Party is now getting 16.59% of the vote in Traeger. In other words, what Robbie Katter has done is stolen the clothes off the Labor Party, but alas for the LNP, they get 10% in that seat, and he's stolen the clothes off the LNP. So good third-party candidates who stand up for their electorates and fight for it and all that sort of thing will take votes off the major parties. Now, at the last election, and I'm fully answering Raj's question, I hope, what happened, Raj, at the last election was that the One Nation Party made a decision that they would put all sitting members last. Now, what that tended to do, where One Nation were able to hand out how to vote cards, and that's always open to some doubt. It is true that the One Nation vote back to the Conservatives didn't run at 70%. It ran between 50 and 70% for two reasons. One was the LNP decision, the One Nation decision to direct sitting members last. And secondly, they just have a chronic inability to hand out how to vote cards on the day to make their choices known to people. Plus,
can I just jump in there?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
I think it also, there might be a little problem with actually filling out a ballot as well. I did some scrutineering in in a school in the last federal election. Usually there's about 2,900 votes on the Saturday, but because of the 3-week pre-polling, it was actually down to just down under 1,300. Now, out of those 1,300 votes, there was 106 informals, which is a pretty good percentage. And I'm sorry to say, but 76 of those informals were people who voted One Nation first.
And they just
did not get through the whole. There was 8 candidates, so they had to put at least 7 numbers in, but they failed to get through the whole, get down to 7. So that was a sort of a really eye-opener in regards to the horrendous amount of informal votes in these elections at times.
Yeah. Now, what would cause that at the federal election is this: without a how to vote card, you get 2 pieces of paper, one for the House of Representatives and one for the Senate, and both have 2 different voting systems. In the Senate, it's 1 to 12. In the House of Representatives, you have to fill in every square bar 1, but for safety's sake, every square. Now, that same phenomenon of informality occurred in the most recent by-elections in Queensland, which were held on the same day as the local government elections. And because of COVID-19, you weren't allowed to hand out how to vote cards. There were 2 different systems of voting. One was the local government, where it was simply optional, and in the polling booths where there was the state by-elections in Currumbin and Bundamba, the informal vote went up, and I dare say it went up predominantly because people just put a 1 in the square. In other words, what is causing the problem is the difference in the voting system at times.
Yes, that's a lot. 75 out of 100.
They're going half an hour.
No, yeah, it is. It is. There's no doubt about it.
Can I just grab? We've been going for half an hour on this. We can come back to it a bit later, but I'd just like to hear John give a bit of a rundown on his story and his time in Parliament before we keep going with more facts and figures on the possibility of what happens in the next election.
Sure. I was elected in 1998, and it was the election where One Nation made its first outing, and I was elected for the state seat of Logan, where, and I'm sorry, I don't know who, I think it was you, Bill, may have said about, and I apologise if I've got the wrong person, about One Nation. On that occasion, I had a One Nation candidate who never campaigned at all. In fact, went to the returning officer and asked the returning officer when she was getting her election material the same as Labor to hand out and to put out into letterboxes. And when the returning officer said, look, we don't look after that, she said, well, you're showing bias because he's got all this stuff out there. And there wasn't much he could do to convince her that it wasn't his job to do that. That performance of hers was good for, and she made an appearance at nothing, and that performance was good for a primary vote of 28%.
Wow.
And she grabbed votes off my primary vote to the tune of 16%, forcing me to preferences. And that was an election where 11 One Nation people got elected. And I don't want this podcast to be a bag of One Nation, but I watched the whole 11 get elected as One Nation people, and I think within 2 years there wasn't one Nation person left. They'd all abandoned the party. So I was elected in there. I became chairman of what was and still is the Ethics Committee. But I was a humble backbencher in Logan, and I maintained that position until 2003, I think it was. And then I became a minister in the government and held that position until 2009. And I was elected Speaker of the Queensland Parliament in 2009 to 2012. And by my own choice, after 14 years, I decided it was time to go, rather than have the people make the decision for me. I made my own decision. Now, my other background was that I had lectured part-time at the Queensland University of Technology in government and been a tutor there, very much part-time, up till 1998. And my great pride in that, during that time, is one of the students said to me, we can never work out what your politics are. We don't know whether you're Liberal or Labor. I said, well, I've achieved something. And I maintained that independence when I was Speaker, and when I was asked to go back to academia for a short while, I have maintained that. So whilst I'm wearing the QUT hat, you'll always get, I hope, something straight down the line. It may not be sometimes what you want to hear if you're Labor, and it won't be sometimes what you want to hear if you're LNP or One Nation or Kata or anybody, but it's my best call of the board. Currently, I also do a bit of government relations work, but very much I try to be semi-retired, but there are occasions when I strictly need to get out of the house to get away from my what could otherwise be claustrophobic relationships sometimes. Those of you who are at home all day with your wives would understand what I'm saying. It's always a pleasure to get out.
It's always good to get out and breathe the fresh air. Certainly, John, certainly.
Yeah, I don't want to be quoted as saying that I don't get on with my wife. I do, but, you know, too much of a good thing is wonderful, as Mae West would say. So that's my background. I'm now semi-retired, but always keen to share those experiences with you and the political experiences. And can I congratulate you on being heavily involved in an idea, and more than that, being prepared to set up your own podcast and get out there and argue for the idea. what is missing in Australian politics are people with passion who want to argue for an idea. Argue it. In Australia, we're not terribly good at debating. It quickly degenerates into a personality thing or a personal abuse thing. Don't be afraid to hold your view and go out and argue for it.
Well, that's what.
And I congratulate you on that.
Yes, John, we've always tried to adhere to that sort of notion because we definitely see that the representation that is diminishing in Central and North Queensland is an avid problem leading into the future. And whether or not you are the most avid supporter like ourselves or as most representatives, especially in the Labor Party, would be, and the Liberal Party has been generally, when you speak from candidate to candidate or representative to representative, they like it on the terms of its idea and what it represents, but they might as well be the avid Labor supporter or representative that just doesn't like the idea full stop, and that's that. But I mean, when we use examples like you've even brought up, where you have electorates like Traeger that was such a heavy set Labor electorate and has been traditionally for the most of its existence, which is now essentially in the hands of a minor party and very heavily in the hands of a minor party. And the representation, the percentage of the primary that is now in the hands of the two majors that are led out of Brisbane, it only proves that the problem with representation in our electorates within Central and North Queensland, there is something wrong. And when the people know it, and when you can see it from when the percentages of the votes, it's something that only drives us to want to actively change that and fix the problem. And it's not about that catch call of a fair share. It's not about any of that. It's about this is what's good for us, and it's what's good for the future of my children, anyone's children, if they plan on wanting to have them live down the street. And it's only going to end in more and more electorates diminishing in Central and North Queensland, and more electorates being brought up in the southeast corner, especially as they populate at twice the rate as we do. So there's a horse and a cart scenario as well, where at what point is the decisions that are focused on infrastructure based in the southeast corner and decisions that focus on pleasing the needs of the majority of the population, which is based in the southeast corner, at what point do we say, well, enough's enough, we have to go our own way so we can actually attribute to the growth that we need for our area?
Can I hold the passion is what I'm saying?
Yeah, no, it's Did you have something to say, Bill?
Can I put in 2 points there? I did. So, John, I just wondered from your experience, where do you think the National Party is heading in Queensland? To me, the amazing fact is that Matt Canavan, George Christensen, right, at the federal election go as National Party. They're the biggest supporters of a separate state. But at the state level, they can't get any motion through the party convention. It was, I think, last year or the year before, it was put to the LNP, the annual convention that,
it was.
And it got voted out.
Yeah, the motion was defeated. The motion was defeated.
Yeah, and my other big point, which I brought up, a couple of weeks back again, to me, the problem in Australia is the federation. Just to separate, we have a lot of arguments between ourselves, just to create a new state as the federation stands today, to me, is pointless, because that's what's not working in Australia, where the federal government, has such control over states with the grant system and the GST distribution, that creating a new state, you're just going to end up with the same issues. And I'll give one example which astounded me. When Tony Abbott was Prime Minister, he had a reform white paper on the federation. And what was interesting there, that the federal government gives $13 billion for states for schools, right? But the amazing thing, in Canberra today, there are 2,500 public servants in the Department of Education where the federal government has no jurisdiction. And is this not the basic problem, that we need to work out where this Federation of Australia is heading? and maybe diminish the power, in my eyes, is to diminish the power of Canberra. So there's 2 points for you, John.
Right. Quick history lesson. The uniform taxation power was given to the federal government during the war years of World War II. What that did was changed forever the situation with respect to financing of state-based activities. That has been followed up over the decades by several high court decisions which have ruled invalid some of the state taxes. Now, the whole point of the GST was to give the states a taxation system that might have been fair. The trouble is, it is a consumption-based tax, which is fine if people are consuming and the economy is humming along. It's a real problem when people aren't consuming, a la right now. It is true, Raj, you're quite right. Half of our money comes from the federal government. So to make a state budget, half of the money comes from the federal government. The other half comes from all the taxes that people despise. Payroll tax, stamp duty, these are not favourite things. And Peter Costello brought in the GST with John Howard. They were going to abolish some of those state taxes in exchange for the GST. What happened was in the Senate, they had to compromise with the Australian Democrats, and so a lot of the things that are now services were exempt from GST. And so that deprived the states of that revenue, but lumbered the states with all the taxes that people hated. That's one of the problems. The second problem is the population areas within Australia are predominantly on the East Coast, and Australia is a large country offering first world services with a very limited population. And the services are first world. There's no doubt about that. If you said, oh, come on, that's not right. Well, have a look at America, which is supposed to be first world, where if you're poor, you really miss out. Here, if you're poor, you get looked after. Is the problem the states? Is the problem the federal government? Well, I think that is we've had I'm not aware of too many other countries that have a federal system of government that have been able to pull that together in that particular way. Now, Raj mentioned the Federal Education Department and 2,500 public servants. I don't know what the exact numbers are, Raj, but I'll take you at your word. But the federal government world does fund schools that are not government schools. And there's a whole debate around that, and I won't.
No, I'm just wondering why the thing's shoddy out.
Largely, non-government schools are funded by the people who make the choice not to go to a government school. In most other jurisdictions, that is the case. In Australia, we have decided that if you choose not to go to a government school, that non-government school, in whatever format it takes, will get government funding. And those of you would be familiar with the name Gonski, and you've heard about Gonski and all that sort of thing. How bedeviled that whole funding formula is in the non-government school sector. So, yes, it's true that there's a lot of public servants who probably administer that scheme, but I must say here, it is not an easy scheme to And there's a lot of resentment from those in government systems who say, why should they get a damn thing? Why shouldn't the government just support the government sector? I won't go into that because that's an entire 3 other podcasts.
But John, just quickly, but the point is that handing, the school budget back to state governments, then you can hold the governments accountable. At the moment, each state election, they say, it's a federal government's fault. We're not accountable for this.
Yeah, you're quite right. What has happened is that the federal government assuming more responsibilities like education and health has blurred the lines of accountability. That is undeniable. It is undeniable. Just the same as the state involved in local government, state governments involved in local government, sometimes has blurred the lines with local government. That is true. Now, if you said, well, can't we get a clearer delineation of responsibility? Yes, you can, but the states would totally fund education and health, and they are not in a financial position to do that.
Especially Queensland.
Under no circumstance. No. Well, given the disparate nature of Queensland, it is hard to service because every small town has a school, and no matter how far away they are, they all have to be serviced to the same standard curriculum. And many of the hospitals now, if you think about the hospitals in the 80s, most people had to go from Cairns and Townsville to Brisbane to get specialist services. That is not the case today to the same extent. Oftentimes specialist services are provided to Cairns, Townsville and the provincial cities. Very expensive to do, and nevertheless it's seen as the responsibility of government to do that. Yet servicing the basic services in Queensland is expensive because of the size of the state of Queensland. That is true, undeniable. And that's why there's a lot of cross-subsidy. Cross-subsidy, for example, in power, in electricity, because governments in the 70s and 80s made a decision that the price of electricity would be the same in Balmoral in Brisbane as it is in Birdsville. And that cross-subsidy costs a lot of money. And it's probably the same with road funding, etc. There are cross-subsidies in Queensland. There's no doubt about that.
Oh, well, I feel we've touched on the federal level to a degree which is fairly substantial, and I want to move it back if we can, just to, I guess, the upcoming, just to the upcoming election, which is the state election. And we've discussed the minor parties, and we've discussed their influence on central North Queensland, which has significantly increased in the last few decades, as you clearly laid out. You set the scene perfectly with the fact that the two major parties have diminished in power in most of their respective seats. That much is clear. There's been a certain rise in the votes, especially with your example of the Katter Party, but then we brought up the point of how their involvement is predominantly within the bounds of the Kennedy electorate. But I guess as we touch on this subject of the GST redistribution, John, I was wondering your thoughts on should this election, in the hypothetical scheme of things, should this election bring a hung parliament, and we have the likes of NQ First with 2 or 3 seats and the Katter parties, and if NQ First, I have more faith if there was a hung party to actually come through on the commission for a new state of central North Queensland than I would the Katters. But should the hung parliament occur, and that was to happen, would you see a possible future state having a significantly increased ability to distribute the GST better than it would do out of the southeast corner, out of the government which is so heavy set based in Brisbane?
Well, there's a couple. Let's deal with the hypothetical.
Yeah, of course.
So, what you're hoping for is a hung parliament. What you've got to do is make sure that if there's a hung parliament, that the people are hung by you. That is, that the people who get in there to make that balance of power are committed to what you're about. And for that, you'll need a sophisticated policy development in those parties. And typically minor parties don't have that enriched policy development. And I won't revisit One Nation, it's a personality thing.
I think we all agree generally with that, yes.
Yeah. So if Jason Cost, I've got his name right, I don't mean any offence to him, Jason Costa, yes it is. If he's going to be the voice for the separate state, then he has to have a sophisticated policy development with that. In other words, he has to have a roadmap of what he wants to do. He's going to push for this in Parliament, and that's going to lead to this, and you're going to hold those parties, the members of that party who go into Parliament around that have got to be committed to that cause and vote for that cause and extract that promise out of the major party in exchange for their support on confidence motions in the Parliament. Now, historically, a new show like the Costigan Party will not have that adherence to discipline that the major parties get. That has proven to be the case with One Nation and the various independents. What has tended to happen is they fracture. The Katters haven't because they're tightly built within that one electorate. It would be interesting to see if the Katters became a mass breakout show, and they're running second now in Warrego and a few others, whether they could maintain that ironclad discipline. That would be your biggest enemy is the how in this. How are you going to make sure that whoever emerges is disciplined enough to extract that concession from whoever forms the major nucleus of the major parties, if you understand what I'm saying. So if Labor dips beyond under 46, they've got to hunt around to get enough to govern, not in their own right, obviously, but they are dependent on others. Now, if the North Queensland First Party says, well, they're the ones to go with, then they've got to extract that commitment out of them. If it's the LNP, then what configuration? It's no good to you if the Queensland First Party is 3 and the Katters are 4 or 3 and that's 6 and there's somebody else and that's 7. Everybody will fragment around what they want.
Of course,
They
yes.
want more for their electorate. So there's your hassle. The one you're backing has got to be the largest of the minors, if I can put it that way. And it's got to have a disciplined show around it. Does that make sense?
No, you've covered it well there. Yes, of course. And we always,
Yes.
we constantly have the Katters whenever we've had dealings with that. They mention the magic number of 7, and just if we could just hit that 7 representatives, we'll get everything we want, and all your dreams will come true. But essentially, when it comes down to the boiling point, it's like, well, for how long will that be the case? And a hung parliament doesn't come around every election. Your power will significantly be gone by the next election if there's a majority, and it doesn't solve any problems for the future.
Although, let me deal with that proposition that you just put for the moment. It is truer these days that you're having more hung parliaments. Let me give you an example. There was a hung parliament in 95. When the Borbidge government came in 96, it was a hung parliament. When I got elected in 98, it was a hung parliament, right? When the Palaszczuk government got elected in 2015, it was a hung parliament. Just keep me on the map, please. So 95, hung parliament. 96, a hung parliament. 98, a hung parliament. 2015, a hung parliament. The frequency of them, gentlemen, is occurring more. Your prospects are for influence are growing. As the minor parties' votes in North and far northern Queensland is collapsing, your day is coming.
With one
I was about to make a point, and I think Bill wants to make the same point about redistribution.
Sorry, Bill.
Sorry, Bill.
Yeah, it's the reason Brisbane was founded was the result of the 2017 redistribution. We went from 89 seats to 93, and all 4 new seats were in the southeast Queensland. So
no, that's not quite right. There was a new one in North Queensland. That's where Hill came from.
No, Hill was Dalrymple. Hill was just changed around, and it was still Dalrymple. Didn't actually get a new one, an extra one. We got a name change and a boundary change, and it went from Dalrymple to Hill. But all 4 seats, the additional seats, were all in southeast Queensland. 1 Gold Coast, 1 Sunshine Coast, and 2 in Brisbane. 1 north of the river, 1 south of the river. Now,
I thought there was 1 in North Queensland, but you're
that was Hill. Dalrymple changed it.
You're quite right.
Boundary and became Hill.
Right. You're quite right.
We do
wrong. You were right. Yeah.
We do homework.
You did it better than me, and congratulations on that.
But here comes the problem. Southeast Queensland is populating at more than 2 times the rate of Central and North Queensland. We go to the 2024 redistribution that's due. There will be approximately nearly 500,000 extra voters on the roll by then, because the people coming up to Queensland and coming into Queensland are already in the voting age. It's not just the young ones growing up. Queensland gets a lot of imports from interstate and internationally, and they hover in that southeast corner. So that's why it's so fast growing. Now, we get to a situation come the 24 redistribution, and we've got another nearly 500,000 voters to fiddle around to get in the boundaries and change the quota a bit. We could be looking at a situation where there will be 98 seats in Parliament, and all 5 additional seats will be again in the southeast corner. And because our vote is our population rate is so slow, we are in danger of actually losing seats. So we've got, I only count 17 seats in Central North Queensland, because that south of Gladstone, that goes right down to Bell, which is only about 164 kilometres out of Brisbane.
Yeah.
So although
I counted it because it does sort of start at Banana and Billawheeler.
It is actually sort of in the grouping of Central Queensland, but it's completely out of our range sort of thing. So I'll just stick with the 17. But if we get to a situation we end up with 98 seats and we only have 15, like we drop from our current about 18% representation in Brisbane Parliament down to about 14. That's an awful scary thing. And the thing is, if that continues to happen, we will gradually lose the ability, even if we get a reasonable number of people in North Queensland supporting a separate state, we won't achieve the balance of power, because the simple mathematics is we just won't get the number by itself in Central North Queensland. So that is a bit of a worry.
I don't see the Parliament increasing in size at all. It took from 1986 to 2015 to get the modest increase that it did. But in terms of population growth, I'm not sure what the recession and the pandemic do to population growth. It certainly means that international migration will stop and stop dead. But growth is still occurring, and it's very much occurring in pockets. There's growth certainly in and around Cairns, and there's certainly growth in and around Townsville. That's what threw me with my calculations. The other thing that is protecting you is that there are special seats that were created because of the size. So Traeger and Cook and Warrego and Gregory are protected in that distance is used as a formula for population. And that is what's, Cook, for example, at the last election, had quite a significant fewer number of electors than commensurate seats in the provincial cities, and certainly less than in Brisbane, because that formula was stuck with.
I think the quoted difference is only around about 3,000 now. It's not a huge number anymore.
No, but it's still there. If you're worried about growth in southeast Queensland is quite uneven, actually. It tends to be on the Gold Coast and the Sunshine Coast. Look, to be honest, I haven't had a look at how they're all growing recently.
Well, I suppose the fundamental thing is it'll be significantly different as of now, and it'll be interesting to see how that growth is affected in the post-COVID days. So. And
you've encouraged me now to do some homework. I'll go and have a look at those enrolments.
Yeah. Well, gentlemen, I was about to say...
And Bill, what I'll do with you...
Sorry.
Well, I'll get back to you by email.
I just want to mention we've just passed an hour as well, gentlemen, so we might start wrapping things up. It's been a riveting conversation, and it's really interesting to hear the statistics based on the percentages of the voter base in Central and North Queensland electorates. So thank you for that in-depth analysis that you've given us tonight, John. But was that you, Raj, that was just starting to ask a question?
Yeah, last question.
Yeah, sure.
For someone living in Brisbane, how do you think the Green vote is going to play out at the state election? I say that because if Labor loses some seats in Brisbane to the Greens, North Queensland becomes more important.
That's correct. And that's the point I've been making. You guys are in the box seat in that there's more at play. There's all the seats that are held by the non-majors are in North and Far North Queensland. In Brisbane itself, the Greens person who holds the seat in the inner north side holds that very, very narrowly. And a recovery in the Liberal Party vote there, or the Liberal National Party vote, would see him turfed out. The Greens are a prospect in South Brisbane, that is true, and they tend to do very, very well inner north and, if you will, inner northwestern parts of Brisbane. They do well in the centre of Brisbane. But as they move out, the further out they go, the worse their vote gets. They're very much a syndrome of the inner city. And their biggest chance is defeating the former Deputy Premier Jackie Trad, and especially if the Liberal and National parties decide to direct their preferences to the Greens. So what that does for all of you is it adds another revolution of people.
Well, I hope that answered your question, Raj. I hope that answered your question, Raj. And Bill, go ahead.
I want to drag you back to your time in Parliament.
Oh, must you?
And see if the people of Cairns are right to give you a whack. you were once the State Development and Industrial Relations and Employment Minister.
Yes, I was.
Now, that seems to be the period 2006 to 2009.
Yeah, it wasn't that whole time. It was 2006 to 2000 and whenever Bly got in. 8, was it 7 or 8?
Well, you might be safe, but I don't know if you recollect, back in 2009, or just before that, there was a tender for the Royal Navy for the air warfare destroyers. And a Cairns company, NQEA,
yep, I remember NQEA,
won the contract. Now, they did a lot of work, and there was a heap of people, like, from what I gather, from all walks of life across Cairns in regards to different industries and different levels in both private and public office sort of thing, pushing for those. And they won that contract. But I'm a latecomer. I only came to Cairns in 2012, but I just hear this story, and this is one of the things I don't quite understand about the shipbuilding industry here. That contract was lost to South Australia, and there is quite a lot of resentment, and there seems to be blame laid at the hands of the Brisbane government of the day. I'm not sure if that's true or not, but because I wasn't here at that time. But do you remember anything of that case? Why?
No, I don't.
It didn't get the support to sort of.
I don't recall it. The fact that it's a defence contract, it would have been handled federally. And if you said, well, I just don't recall it.
Okay, then we'll let you off.
But I'll tell you the one I do recall is Ramatel. I met those guys when I was State Development Minister, and they were a German company who were bidding for defence work, and I met them. And I met them in around about 2007 or 8. And it took from then until 2016 or 17 when that contract was let. That might have been 2018. For them to get that foothold in Queensland. That's how long it takes. And now they'll be a big employer. I just don't recall that sort of contract at all. Now, you can put that down to an imperfect memory on my part.
Complete innocence,
I think the suggestion was
and it could well be that. I mean, I've got no reason to tell you because what's the point?
No, of course not.
The general consensus was that as part of the contract, the state government was obliged to guarantee some works in regards to infrastructure to allow the contract to go ahead, and they didn't stump up the money, so the contract was forfeited to South Australia.
Yeah,
but we'll find out one day from someone who had something to do with it.
I genuinely don't remember that. I remember being asked to support all sorts of ventures like funding for tourism routes to various places. I recall all that. No, I just don't. I remember NQEA, knew it well, but I don't remember ever passing up on behalf of the state of Queensland the ability to create jobs in Queensland.
Well, do you know what? It's completely understandable that you couldn't remember something from your tenure when you were in government there, because not only was it so far away, and I'll put you down to a perfect memory, John, but so far away, I think we can say that the state's so large that there's so much to have to manage that it's understandable you couldn't remember everything that would have been in the portfolio anyway. We hope to solve that.
Well, the other thing is it's about 12 or 13 years ago.
No, but that's we could only make it easier for future people who have those sort of portfolios to make it two separate states, and then the job will be a lot more easier.
Sure. Yeah. There you go.
Yeah. But listen, I think we should call it a night, gentlemen. It's been over an hour, and we really appreciate your time to come and join us this evening, John. It's been an absolute pleasure. It's been very in-depth and very, you've got a wealth of knowledge from both your tenure when you were a representative and now as an adjunct professor. And it's great to know that you're doing well there teaching the guys down in Brisbane, and we really appreciate your time. It's been fantastic. Thanks for taking us down memory lane as much as anything as well. Thanks for taking us down memory lane. And yeah, we wish you the very best and good luck in the state election.
With my predictions.
With your predictions,
I'm not looking forward to that.
No.
But listen, thanks very much to you, Bill, for setting this up, for contacting me. I really appreciate it. Thanks everyone for tonight. Doing is ambitious, but above all, maintain your passion, maintain your spirit, and keep up the good work on behalf of the people you're trying to do good things for.
Thank you very much, John. Yeah, we're trying to achieve great things, and good evening to you too, Bill.
Good night.
Good night, gentlemen. See you later.
Thank you.